The crate arrived in Berlin in the winter of 1906, packed with straw and sand from a place most Europeans had never heard of. Inside, wrapped in burlap darkened by decades of desert dust, were fragments of clay, some no larger than a playing card, others the size of small books. Each one bore thousands of tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface before the mud had hardened. The archaeologist who opened the crate that morning, a man named Robert Coldaway, wore no gloves. He lifted one of the larger pieces and turned it slowly under the lamplight. The clay was cool and surprisingly heavy. Along its edges, the impressions caught the light like shallow footprints left by birds walking across wet cement. What made his hands pause was not the age of the object. He'd handled older. It was the density of the script. Over 700 distinct symbols in what was supposed to be humanity's first attempt at writing. Not pictographs of animals and sun. Not crude marks counting grain. This was a language already mature, already complex, already carrying the weight of a civilization that shouldn't have existed yet. He set the tablet down carefully. His notes from that day, still preserved in the museum archive, contain a single underlined sentence. This is not how beginnings look. In southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers slow and spread into marshland before reaching the Persian Gulf, silence accumulates like sediment. The ruins of ancient cities rise from the plains in mounds called tells, artificial hills built from thousands of years of collapsed mud brick, one layer pressed upon another. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash. Names that once meant empire, now meaning only coordinates on archaeological maps. Beneath the surface of these tells, in chambers that were deliberately sealed and deliberately preserved, rest tens of thousands of clay tablets, each one a fragment of the oldest continuous written record humanity has ever produced. Each one marked with cuneiform, wedge writing, a script so named because each character is built from impressions made by pressing a cut reed into soft clay at different angles. The marks look almost organic, like the tracks of insects or the impressions left by reeds bending in the wind. But they are neither accidental nor decorative. They are language, and they contain something history was not prepared to find. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where the past refuses to simplify, consider subscribing. And if you're listening to this in the dark somewhere, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I want to picture this mystery stretching across time zones, reaching you wherever sleep is beginning to pull you under. The discovery didn't announce itself with fanfare. It happened with dust and patience, and the particular kind of obsession that drives people to spend years digging in places where summer temperatures reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists, funded by museums hungry for antiquities and nations hungry for prestige, began systematic excavations across Mesopotamia. What they were looking for were the origins of civilization. What they found was something that had already been civilized for a very long time. At Uruk, the site believed to be one of the world's first cities, excavators broke through layers of wind-polished brick and descended into chambers that had not seen daylight in over 4,000 years. The rooms were small, built with mathematical precision, their walls lined with niches. In those niches, Stacked with the care of a modern library were clay tablets, thousands of them, catalogued, organized, deliberately archived by people who understood that what they were recording mattered enough to preserve. When the tablets were carefully extracted and shipped to museums in London, Berlin, Paris, and Philadelphia, scholars faced the painstaking work of translation. Cuneiform had been partially deciphered earlier in the century, thanks to the Behistun inscription in Persia, a multilingual text carved into a cliff face that served as a Rosetta Stone for ancient Mesopotamian languages. But the Sumerian tablets were older and stranger than anything the Behistun inscription had prepared them for. What the scholars found, as they worked their way through the script symbol by symbol, was not what they expected. They were not reading the halting first sentences of a species learning to write. They were reading tax records, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, legal contracts specifying land boundaries and water rights, hymns to gods whose names had not been spoken aloud in 4 millennia, mathematical tables calculating compound interest and the areas of irregular fields. The people who had written these tablets called themselves the Sumerians, though that name was given to them by later cultures. They had no word for themselves in the way we might say American or Chinese. They were simply the people of Sumer, the land between the rivers, and from the moment that name entered the historical record, something in our understanding of human development began to crack, because Sumer does not appear gradually, it appears complete. Around 3500 BCE, seemingly overnight in archaeological terms, cities emerge across the southern plains of Mesopotamia, not villages that slowly expand, not camps that eventually cluster into settlements, cities. Uruk at its height covers over 2 square miles and houses an estimated 40 to 80,000 people. Its central temple complex, the Iana, is built on a platform that required millions of mud bricks, each one formed in a mold, dried in the sun, and laid in courses so precise that modern engineers still study their construction techniques. The streets are planned. The irrigation canals are engineered to distribute water across miles of fields, with flow rates calculated to prevent both flooding and drought. Workshops produce pottery on wheels, metalwork in bronze and copper, textiles woven on looms that produce standardized widths of cloth. Trade networks stretch from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, importing lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and the writing. The cuneiform script in its earliest known form contains over 700 distinct symbols, not an alphabet, not simple pictographs. A complex logosyllabic system where symbols can represent whole words, syllables, or even grammatical markers depending on context. Learning to read and write cuneiform required years of training in scribal schools, where students copied texts over and over until their hand could form each wedge with perfect consistency. This is not how civilizations are supposed to begin. History, as we have been taught to understand it, loves slow progressions. Stone tools lead to bronze. Copper is discovered, then alloyed. Simple shelters evolve over centuries into villages, then towns, then cities. Pictographs, a drawing of a bird to mean bird, gradually become more abstract, more efficient, eventually transforming into alphabets where symbols represent sounds rather than objects. The Egyptians, for comparison, start with pictographic hieroglyphs around 3200 BCE and take over 1,000 years to develop the more streamlined hieratic script. The Chinese writing system evolves over centuries from oracle bone inscriptions. The Phoenician alphabet, ancestor of our own, begins as a simplified adaptation of Egyptian hieroglyphs around 1050 BCE. But Sumer skips the rehearsal. It walks onto the stage of history, already knowing its lines, already fluent, already performing with a sophistication that suggests centuries of practice we cannot find. Scholars have spent over a century trying to explain this. Some suggest we simply haven't found the earlier developmental stages yet, that erosion and the slow violence of time have erased the fumbling centuries, the trial and error millennia. The region is, after all, built on floodplains. Rivers change course. Silt buries. Clay dissolves. Perhaps the evidence is there, 6 meters deeper than anyone has yet dug, waiting in strata we haven't reached. Others propose that Sumer inherited its knowledge from neighboring cultures whose names are lost to flood and ruin, that there was a predecessor civilization, now vanished, that taught the Sumerians everything they knew. But no such culture has ever been found. No transitional sites, no Proto-Sumerian settlements showing the slow accumulation of technological and social complexity. The Sumerians themselves, however, offer a different explanation. It is written in their own hand, pressed into clay, that has survived while empires rose and fell around it. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not invented, not discovered, descended. The verb is passive. Kingship, and with it, the apparatus of civilization was given. It came from somewhere else, and was installed in the city of Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian cities according to their own records. The text is part of what scholars call the Sumerian King List, a document that has caused more academic discomfort than perhaps any other artifact from the ancient world. We will return to it. But for now, notice the phrasing. This is not the language of a people celebrating their own ingenuity. This is the language of restoration, of receiving, of remembering something that existed before, as if everything they built was an act of reconstruction, not invention. Picture yourself in a museum archive late at night, the kind of place where the air is climate-controlled to exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% humidity, where the lights dim automatically after 10 minutes of no movement, where the only sounds are the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional creak of shelving settling under the weight of millennia. You pull on cotton gloves, mandatory, because the oils on human skin can degrade ancient clay, and a curator lifts one of the Sumerian tablets from its padded tray. The clay is cool through the gloves, slightly rough, heavier than you expect, because it is solid, baked hard by the sun 4,000 years ago, then baked harder still by the accidental fires that consumed the buildings where these tablets were stored. Along its surface, hundreds of tiny wedge marks catch the light, each one pressed deliberately by a reed stylus held in a hand that has not existed for 5,000 years. You tilt the tablet. The shadows shift. The wedges seem almost to move, like a field of grain bending in wind you cannot feel. The curator tells you this particular tablet is a medical text. It describes a treatment for an eye infection using ground turtle shell mixed with salt and a plant whose Sumerian name no longer corresponds to any species we can identify. The dosage is specified, the application method is detailed, the expected recovery time is noted, and at the bottom, in smaller script, is the name of the physician who recorded this knowledge, and the year in which it was written, calculated according to a calendar that tracks lunar months with a precision that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. You set the tablet down carefully. Your hands are shaking slightly, though you could not say exactly why. Perhaps because you have just touched a continuity of human thought that stretches back further than any religion you were raised with. Perhaps because the person who wrote this was trying to heal people using systematic observation and recorded trial, and that makes them less ancient than the word ancient allows. Or perhaps because the curator has just told you that this tablet is one of approximately 5 million that have been excavated from Mesopotamian sites, and scholars estimate that 90% of them remain untranslated. The precision is what haunts you after you leave the archive, not the age, not the exoticism of a dead language. The precision, because precision is not an accident. Precision requires intention, observation, calibration, and time. Lots of time. Generations of time. In the 1920s, a team of scholars working in the basement translation labs of the University of Pennsylvania began to notice something about the mathematical content of certain tablets. The Sumerians used a numerical system based on the number 60, not 10, like most cultures that count on their fingers. 60. This system, called sexagesimal, is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. It is why a circle contains 360 degrees, 60 times 6. It is why an equilateral triangle has angles of 60 degrees. These are not arbitrary, cultural preferences. They are mathematical inheritances from Sumer, transmitted through Babylon to Greece, to the Islamic Golden Age, to medieval Europe, to the modern world. But here is what troubled the scholars in Philadelphia. A base 60 system is not intuitive. It is not something you stumble into while counting sheep. It is something you choose because of its extraordinary mathematical utility. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. 12 factors. Compare that to 10, which has only 4 factors, 1, 2, 5, 10. A sexagesimal system makes fractions easier, division simpler, complex calculations more elegant. It is the kind of system you develop not at the beginning of mathematical thought, but after you have already done enough mathematics to recognize the limitations of simpler systems. And yet, there it is, in the earliest Sumerian tablets, already complete, already applied to everything from grain taxation to the measurement of fields to the calculation of construction materials needed for ziggurats that would take decades to build. The astronomical tablets were worse, or better, depending on your tolerance for historical vertigo. In certain tablets dating to around 3000 BCE, tablets that record observations of the night sky with a level of detail that suggests institutional continuity spanning generations, the Sumerians tracked the movements of celestial bodies with precision that should not have been possible. They identified the planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They noted their retrograde motions, those periods when planets appear to move backward against the background stars due to Earth's own orbit creating a relative motion effect. They calculated the synodic periods of these planets, meaning the time it takes for a planet to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth. These calculations are accurate to within a margin of error that modern astronomers find unsettling. More than that, the Sumerians built their temple complexes, their ziggurats, with orientations aligned to celestial events, the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the rising of certain stars that marked the beginning of agricultural seasons. These alignments are not approximate. They are precise to fractions of a degree, and they require multi-generational observation to achieve, because you cannot calibrate a building to the solstice by watching the sun for a single year. You must track it over decades, noting the subtle drift, the tiny variations, the long cycles that only become apparent when you watch the sky as if your survival depends on it. Which, to be fair, it did. Agriculture requires knowing when to plant. Irrigation requires knowing when floods will come. But the level of precision in Sumerian astronomical records exceeds practical necessity. It suggests something else: curiosity, systematic inquiry, the establishment of institutions dedicated to watching and recording, not because it is immediately useful, but because knowledge itself has value. The mainstream explanation for all of this has remained remarkably consistent for over a century. We simply haven't found the developmental stages yet. Somewhere, buried deeper or eroded away or still waiting in unexcavated tells, there must be the clumsy first attempts. The proto-cities where people were still figuring out how to organize labor and distribute food. The primitive star charts that gradually became more sophisticated. The simple tally marks that eventually evolved into cuneiform. These things must exist, because the alternative, that Sumer appeared essentially complete, violates everything we understand about how human societies develop. And yet, the archaeological record refuses to cooperate. The region around Sumer has been excavated more intensively than almost anywhere else on Earth. Every major tell has been probed. Thousands of test trenches have been dug looking for earlier occupation layers, and what they find beneath the Sumerian cities is not proto-civilization. It is Neolithic villages, simple farming communities with no writing, no large-scale architecture, no evidence of the complex social organization required to build cities. And then, in a geological eye blink, a few centuries at most, Sumer. The Sumerians themselves seem unbothered by this gap. In fact, they explicitly address it, not with the anxiety of a civilization trying to explain its own unlikely existence, but with the calm of people recording what they have been told, and what they were told, what they preserved in tablets copied and recopied for 2,000 years, is that kingship, meaning civilization, governance, the knowledge required to build cities and organize societies, did not develop. It descended. It was given. By whom? The tablets are clear on this point as well, though clarity does not mean comfort. Before we go there, though, we need to talk about the King List, because the King List is where the entire narrative of human history, as a slow, linear progression, breaks down so completely that most scholars simply refuse to discuss it. The Sumerian King List is a document that exists in multiple copies, the most complete of which was found in the 1920s and is now catalogued as WB 444 in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. It is a simple text in structure, a chronological listing of kings who ruled in various Sumerian cities, along with the length of their reigns, stretching back to a time before the flood. The post-flood section of the king list is relatively uncontroversial. It names kings whose reigns can be cross-referenced with other archaeological and textual evidence. The lengths of their reigns are plausible: 20 years, 35 years, 42 years. These kings built temples that we have excavated. They fought wars that other tablets record. They correspond to a historical reality that archaeology can verify. But the pre-flood section is different. Before the flood, according to the king list, 8 kings ruled in 5 cities. Their reigns lasted on average 30,000 years. One king, Alulim of Eridu, the first king ever listed, ruled for 28,800 years. Another, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. The mainstream explanation is immediate and obvious: mythology, divine exaggeration, an attempt by later kings to legitimize their rule by claiming descent from impossibly ancient and therefore semi-divine ancestors. This is how kingship worked in the ancient world. You claimed you were chosen by the gods, and one way to do that was to trace your lineage back to a time when gods and kings were indistinguishable. Except the king list doesn't present these pre-flood kings as gods. It presents them as kings. It uses the same formulaic language for them as it does for the historical kings whose tombs we have found. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. The same grammatical structure, the same matter-of-fact tone. No epithets, no miracles, just a record. And then, after listing these 8 kings and their impossibly long reigns, the king list includes a single sentence: then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship is reinstated. The cities are rebuilt. The reigns become plausible again. And every single one of the post-flood cities listed in the king list has been archaeologically confirmed. Kish, Uruk, Ur. They existed. The kings named in the post-flood section existed. The king list, in other words, is accurate about everything we can verify, which makes its pre-flood section considerably harder to dismiss. But it is the flood itself, that single transitional event that separates the impossible past from the historical present, that inverts everything. Because if the flood is myth, then the entire king list should be myth. But if the flood is real, then the king list's insistence on recording what came before it demands a different kind of attention. In 1929, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur. Ur is mentioned in the Bible as the birthplace of Abraham, but by Woolley's time it was a massive tell in southern Iraq, its streets buried under centuries of wind-blown sand and the ruins of its own collapsed buildings. Woolley's team dug down through the occupation layers, carefully cataloging pottery styles, tools, and architectural remains. Each layer represented a different period in the city's history, the most recent on top, the most ancient at the bottom. At a depth of about 12 meters, they reached what archaeologists call a sterile layer, a layer of earth with no human artifacts. Usually, this marks the end of occupation. You have reached the natural soil beneath the city. But Woolley kept digging, and beneath the sterile layer he found something strange. 8 feet of silt. Clean, water-deposited silt with no artifacts, no occupation debris, no sign of human presence, just sediment laid down slowly by standing water. And beneath that silt layer another occupation level, older buildings, older pottery, evidence of human activity that predated the flood layer by centuries. Woolley's team expanded the excavation. They found the same pattern across multiple test trenches. Occupation, flood layer, occupation. The flood deposit was consistent, approximately 8 feet thick, and it was dated, through ceramic analysis and stratigraphic correlation, to around 4,000 to 3,500 BCE. Exactly when the Sumerian king list said the flood occurred. The mainstream explanation then and now is that this was a local flood, a particularly bad season where the Tigris and Euphrates overflowed their banks more severely than usual. The flood was devastating enough to be remembered in cultural memory and, over generations, exaggerated into a world-destroying deluge. This explanation is reasonable. Floods happened regularly in Mesopotamia. The rivers were unpredictable. Cities were built on floodplains. A particularly catastrophic flood could have wiped out settlements and been seared into the collective memory of survivors. But here is where the explanation begins to fray. The Sumerian flood narrative, which predates the biblical story of Noah's Ark by at least 1,500 years, describes a flood that was deliberate. It was not a natural disaster. It was a decision. The gods, according to the text, decided to destroy humanity. One god, Enki, defied the decision and warned a man named Ziusudra, later called Utnapishtim in the Babylonian version, later still called Noah in the Hebrew version, to build a boat. The dimensions of the boat are specified. The construction materials are listed. The animals to be saved are catalogued. Ziusudra survives. The flood recedes, and kingship is reinstated. The story appears not just in the king list, but in multiple independent texts: the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and, most famously, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the full story in detail so precise that scholars have called it eerily mechanical for a myth. But what unsettles is not the story. Every culture has flood myths. What unsettles is what happens immediately after the flood in the archaeological record. Sumer begins, not gradually, not over the course of 1,000 years as survivors slowly rebuild and reinvent agriculture and writing and mathematics. Immediately. Within decades of the flood layer at Ur, the first cities appear. Eridu, the first city named in the king list, is already a complex urban center by 3,800 BCE. Uruk follows within a century. The writing appears. The mathematics appears. The astronomical observations appear. The irrigation networks appear. The temple complexes appear. It is as if the flood did not destroy civilization. It created the conditions for civilization. The mainstream explanation is migration. After the flood, a new group of people, already developed, already organized, migrated into the region and settled there. They brought their knowledge with them. This explains the sudden appearance of complexity, without requiring us to accept the king list's insistence that kingship descended. But there is no evidence of migration. Genetic studies of human remains from pre-flood Mesopotamian sites, and post-flood Sumerian sites show continuity. The same population. Linguistic analysis of Sumerian reveals it is a language isolate. It does not belong to any known language family. It is not related to the Semitic languages of the region, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew. It is not related to Indo-European languages. It is not related to anything. If the Sumerians migrated in, where did they migrate from? And why is there no trace of their language anywhere else? The alternative, the one that the tablets themselves propose, is not migration but instruction, the flood destroyed, and then something rebuilt. Or rather, someone taught the survivors how to rebuild, and the tablets are very specific about who did the teaching. But one set of tablets describes what came before the water, and what it describes shouldn't be possible, not according to any model of human development we have ever constructed, not according to archaeology, not according to anthropology, not according to the careful progressions we use to make the past feel safe and comprehensible. These tablets describe the creators, and what the creators were doing, according to the oldest written testimony humanity has ever produced, was not divine. It was technical. The tablet arrived at the University of Pennsylvania in 1893, part of a shipment of fragments excavated from the ancient city of Nippur by an expedition led by John Punnett Peters. It was catalogued as CBS 10,673, CBS standing for Catalogue of the Babylonian Section, and stored in the basement archives where it waited, like thousands of other fragments, for a scholar with enough time and funding to attempt translation. That scholar turned out to be Arno Pobel, a German Assyriologist who began working on the tablet in the early 1900s. What he translated made him pause long enough that his notes from that period contain multiple crossed-out phrases, as if he kept trying to find a way to phrase what he was reading that would sound less unsettling. The tablet was badly damaged. Only about 1/3 of its original text remained legible, but what survived was enough to reconstruct the basic narrative. It was written in Old Babylonian, copied from an earlier Sumerian source that no longer existed. The text described the creation of humanity, but not in the way the scholars expected. There was no divine breath, no clay formed lovingly into human shape by benevolent deity, no garden, no test of obedience. What the Eridu Genesis described was a problem that needed solving. The text opens with a statement that reads, in Pobel's translation, like the minutes of a committee meeting. When the gods were man, they bore the toil, they carried the work basket. Read that again. When the gods were man, past tense. Not when the gods created man, but when the gods themselves performed the labor that humans would later inherit. The verb structure in Sumerian is unambiguous. The gods were doing manual work, digging, carrying, building. And they were, the text makes clear, deeply unhappy about it. The tablet is fragmentary, so the full context is lost to time and damage. But what remains suggests this. Before humans existed, the gods, or rather a class of divine beings called the Igigi, were responsible for the physical labor required to build and maintain the world. They dug the channels for the Tigris and Euphrates. They cleared the land. They carried earth in baskets. And after a period the text describes as 40 years, they revolted. The word used in Sumerian is specific, not complaint, not petition, revolt. The Igigi threw down their tools, set fire to their equipment, and marched on the house of Enlil, the chief administrator of the gods. The situation was, the tablet suggests, on the verge of violence. Enlil's response, according to the text, was to order their extermination. But another god intervened. His name was Enki, sometimes called Ea in later Babylonian texts. Enki was known in Sumerian mythology as the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of crafts. He was, in the terminology the tablets use, the engineer. And Enki proposed a solution that would satisfy the laborers without requiring their destruction. Create a replacement workforce. The tablet becomes more fragmented here, but the outline is clear. Enki suggests creating a new being, something that can perform the labor the Igigi refuse to do, but something that is not divine, and therefore has no standing to revolt. The being will be made from clay, but not only clay. It will be infused with something divine. Blood, specifically the blood of a god. The text says, "Let a god be slaughtered, and with his flesh and blood let Nintu mix clay." Nintu. The name appears suddenly, without introduction, as if the reader is already expected to know who she is. In other tablets, she is called Ninhursag, or Mamu, or simply the Mother Goddess. Her title in this text is the Lady Who Gives Birth, and she is given the task of creation, not as a mystical act, but as a technical project. The tablet breaks off shortly after this. What survives of the Eridu Genesis does not describe the creation process in detail. For that, we need another text, one that was not fully reconstructed until 1965, when scholars finally pieced together fragments that had been scattered across museums in London, Istanbul, and Baghdad. The text is called the Atrahasis Epic, and it is far more specific than anyone was ready for. In a vault beneath the British Museum, in a climate-controlled room where the temperature never varies by more than half a degree, there are drawers containing thousands of clay tablet fragments. Most are smaller than your palm. Some are so worn that the cuneiform impressions are barely visible, shallow ghosts of wedges that once carried meaning. The fragments are organized by site of origin, by approximate date, by language, but many remain unmatched, pieces of a puzzle with no picture on the box, no certainty that all the pieces are even present. In the early 1960s, a scholar named Wilfred Lambert began attempting to reconstruct one particular text that existed only in fragments. He knew from references in other tablets that a long narrative called Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, had once existed. It was cited, quoted, referenced, but no complete copy had ever been found. What Lambert did was assemble every fragment that seemed to match the style, vocabulary, and subject matter of the missing epic. He worked for years, matching edge to edge, comparing handwriting, analyzing which fragments might have been part of the same tablet based on clay composition and firing patterns. By 1965, he had reconstructed enough of the text to publish a translation. What he published has never been adequately explained within mainstream archaeology's framework. The Atrahasis epic is not mythology in the way we use that word to mean story people told to explain things they didn't understand. It is a detailed account, structured chronologically, describing events with the procedural specificity of a project report. It begins with the situation. It describes a crisis. It proposes a solution. It details the implementation of that solution, including multiple failed attempts. and it ends with consequences that ripple forward into historical time. The situation. In the beginning, the text says, there were two classes of divine beings, the Anunnaki, the senior gods who held administrative and decision-making roles, and the Igigi, the junior gods assigned to physical labor. The Igigi's task was to dig the channels that would become the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was not small-scale work. The text describes 40 years of continuous excavation, of carrying earth in baskets, of dredging channels deep enough to redirect the flow of water across hundreds of miles. And then, the crisis. The Igigi revolted. The text is specific about the sequence. First, they burned their tools. Then they marched at night to the house of Enlil, surrounding it while the chief god slept. Enlil woke to find his house encircled by angry laborers. He summoned the council of senior gods. The situation was debated, and Enlil's initial response was unambiguous: destroy the rebels. But Enki spoke, and his argument, as recorded in the tablet, was pragmatic. The labor still needed to be done. The channels still needed to be maintained. Destroying the workers did not solve the problem. It only removed the workforce. What was needed was a replacement, something that could perform the work but lacked the divine status that made revolt possible. His proposal: create a being that blended the earthly and the divine. A hybrid. Take the raw material of the earth, clay, the substance from which all life emerges, and mix it with something that carries the essence of divinity. Not to make gods, but to make something just intelligent enough, just capable enough, to perform complex labor. The text records that the gods agreed, and they assigned the project to Nintu. What happens next in the Atrahasis epic is difficult to read as metaphor. The tablet describes a specific process. First, a god is selected to be slaughtered. His name is We'ila, sometimes translated as Geshtu'e, meaning God who has intelligence. The text is explicit. This god possesses something the hybrid beings will need: understanding, consciousness, the capacity for directed thought. We'ila is killed. His blood is collected. Nintu mixes the divine blood with clay. And then comes a phrase that has troubled translators for decades. From his flesh and blood let Nintu mix clay, that God and man may be mixed together in the clay. Mixed. Not created. Not formed. Mixed. The verb in Sumerian suggests combination, integration, blending at a fundamental level, as if what is being described is not sculpture, but synthesis. The text continues. Nintu fashions 14 pieces of clay, 7 to become male, 7 to become female. But she does not work alone. 14 birth goddesses are summoned. Each one is assigned one piece of clay. And then the text describes what sounds unsettlingly like gestation. The clay pieces are placed inside the birth goddesses. A period of time passes. The tablet is damaged here, but later references suggest months, and then the goddesses give birth. Not to clay, to living beings, humans, but the first attempts fail. The tablet describes malformations. Beings that cannot reproduce. Beings that lack full motor function. Beings that die shortly after birth. Nintu makes adjustments. The text uses a word that translates roughly as she refined the process, as if creation is iterative, as if it requires trial and error. Eventually, the process succeeds. Humans are born who can survive, reproduce, and perform the labor the gods require. The Igigi are relieved of their duties. Humanity begins its work. And the gods, the text says, rest. The mainstream explanation for the Atrahasis epic like the Eridu Genesis, is that it is mythological metaphor. Ancient people trying to understand their own existence through story. The gods represent natural forces, the earth, the water, the processes of agriculture and fertility. The creation of humans from clay is a symbolic representation of humanity's connection to the soil, to farming, to the earth that sustains us. The divine blood mixed into the clay represents the spark of consciousness, the thing that separates humans from animals. This explanation is tidy. It allows the text to be meaningful without being literal. It preserves the boundary between myth and history. But the explanation wobbles when you look at the details, because the Atrahasis epic does not describe creation the way myths usually do. Myths tend toward the archetypal, the poetic, the grand gesture. A god speaks and light appears. A goddess dreams and the world is born. Creation is instantaneous, effortless, perfect from the first moment. But Nintu's process is not perfect. It fails. Multiple times. The text describes her adjusting variables, trying different combinations, refining technique. This is not the language of myth. This is the language of experimentation, of a process that requires skill, knowledge, and iteration. And there is another detail, one that most translations mention only in footnotes, because no one is quite sure what to do with it. The text specifies ingredients, not metaphorical ingredients, specific substances. The clay is mixed not just with blood, but with what the text calls bitumen and spittle of the gods. Bitumen, natural asphalt, found in seeps throughout Mesopotamia, used by Sumerians as waterproofing and mortar. Why include bitumen in a creation myth unless the substance actually mattered to the process being described? And spittle has been interpreted by some translators as saliva, but the Sumerian word can also mean essence, extract, or fluid containing biological information. One scholar, Samuel Noah Kramer, noted in his 1944 translation of Sumerian texts that the specificity of the Atrahasis creation account reads less like theology and more like a technical manual. He did not elaborate, perhaps because elaboration leads to questions academia is not structured to answer. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, in a gallery dedicated to ancient Near Eastern artifacts, there's a small cylinder seal catalogued as A02161. Cylinder seals were used throughout Mesopotamia as a kind of signature and identification. You would roll the carved stone cylinder across wet clay to leave an impression proving the document belonged to you or was authorized by you. This particular seal dates to approximately 2500 BCE, the Akkadian period, though the imagery it depicts is older, copied from Sumerian iconography. The seal shows a seated female figure. She is larger than the other figures in the scene, indicating her importance. In front of her is a table or platform. On the platform are several objects, vessels, containers, something that looks like a tray. And on the tray are what appear to be 14 small figures arranged in 2 rows. The female figure's hand hovers over them. Behind her stand attendant figures, smaller, clearly subordinate. The seal is labeled in the museum as Birth Goddess with Symbolic Figures. The interpretation offered on the placard is that this represents Nintu or Ninhursag, presiding over the miracle of birth, the 14 figures symbolizing humanity emerging from divine creation. But the image does not look symbolic. It looks procedural. The goddess is not praying. She is not gesturing majestically. She is working. Her hand is positioned as if manipulating something on the table. The vessels beside her look like tools. The arrangement of the 14 figures suggests organization, deliberate placement, a system. And this is not the only such depiction. Across dozens of cylinder seals, across temple reliefs, across tablets that describe her titles and domains, Nintu is shown not as a passive vessel of divine will, but as an active agent. She is called the Wise One, the fashioner of humanity, the mother of the gods and humans. But she is also called something else, a title that appears in multiple texts, the Lady of the Rib. That phrase entered the Hebrew Bible centuries later. Eve is created from Adam's rib in Genesis, but the Sumerian texts predate Genesis by well over 1,000 years. And in the Sumerian context, rib is a pun. The word for rib, ti, is the same as the word for life. Nintu is the lady of life, the one who engineered it. The tablets do not describe her as benevolent. They describe her as competent. There is a text, fragmentary and still being reconstructed, that records what might be called her project notes. It describes the process she used to create humans in language that sounds disturbingly clinical. It mentions that 14 birth goddesses were required because the gestation period needed to be distributed. One goddess could not carry all iterations of the experiment simultaneously. It notes that some attempts resulted in beings that could not nurse, could not reproduce, could not perform coordinated labor. It specifies adjustments, more divine essence, less clay, different proportions. And then it uses a phrase that appears 19 times across 9 different tablets spanning 1,500 years of Mesopotamian history. L-U, L-U. The term is Sumerian. It has been translated multiple ways depending on the context and the translator's comfort level with literalism. Primitive worker, mixed being, the created one. But the etymology is straightforward. Lu means man or human. Lu.lu, the doubling, can indicate either emphasis or mixture, either very human or human and something else. The phrase appears most frequently in texts describing the period immediately after the creation event. It is used to distinguish early humans from later humans. Early humans are Lu.lu. Later humans, after several generations, after humanity has spread and diversified, are called Awilu, meaning civilized human. Full human, human in the complete sense. As if Lu.lu was a designation for prototype. Version 1.0. And the texts are very clear about what the Lu.lu were created from. The clay of the earth mixed with the essence of divinity. Or, to strip away the theological language and read it as the Sumerians might have intended, indigenous hominid biology, upgraded with genetic material from the Anunnaki. There is a study published in 1987 by a team of geneticists at the University of California, Berkeley. The study analyzed mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, from women across diverse global populations. What the researchers found was that all human mitochondrial DNA could be traced back to a single common ancestor. They called her Mitochondrial Eve. She lived, according to the genetic clock calculations, approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. Every human alive today carries her genetic signature. This does not mean she was the only woman alive at the time. It means that her genetic line is the only one that survived to the present. All other maternal lineages died out. The study also revealed something else: a genetic bottleneck. At some point in human evolutionary history, the population of our species dropped dramatically, possibly to as few as a few thousand individuals. After that bottleneck, the population exploded, spreading across the globe with a rapidity that evolutionary models struggle to explain. The mainstream explanation is environmental: a supervolcano eruption, a climate shift, some catastrophic event that nearly wiped out humanity, and then conditions improved and we recovered. But the Sumerian Tablets describe exactly this pattern: a small founding population, created deliberately for a specific purpose, and then allowed to reproduce, to spread, to fill the earth. The tablets say that after Nintu succeeded in creating viable humans, the gods dispersed them across the world. They were settled in regions where labor was needed: mining operations, agricultural zones, construction sites, and they were instructed to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the roles the gods no longer wished to perform themselves. Zecharia Sitchin, a scholar whose work remains controversial and largely dismissed by mainstream academia, spent decades translating and interpreting Sumerian texts with a literal rather than metaphorical lens. His central argument was that the Anunnaki were not gods in the supernatural sense, but an advanced species from another world who came to Earth, genetically engineered Homo sapiens from pre-existing hominids, and established early civilization before eventually leaving. Academia rejected this interpretation almost uniformly, and for understandable reasons. Sitchin's conclusions require accepting that ancient people possessed knowledge of genetics, astronomy, and planetary science that should have been impossible. His interpretations require reading gods as extraterrestrial beings, reading divine essence as genetic material, reading clay as indigenous hominid DNA. These are large leaps. They violate Occam's razor. They require extraordinary evidence. But here is what cannot be dismissed. The term LU.LU genuinely does mean mixed one. The creation accounts genuinely do describe a biological process involving specific ingredients and iterative refinement. The timeline genuinely does suggest a sudden appearance of modern human behavior: art, ritual, complex tools, symbolic thought, around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, despite anatomically modern humans existing for 200,000 years. And the Sumerian texts genuinely do not treat the Anunnaki as abstract divine forces, but as physical beings with bodies, lifespans, family trees, and functions. Whether Sitchin's specific interpretation is correct is less important than this. The tablets are describing something. They are describing it consistently across thousands of years. And they are describing it with a level of detail that mythology rarely bothers with. Picture a laboratory. Not a modern one with sterile surfaces and fluorescent lights, but an ancient one. A chamber carved from stone, lit by oil lamps, filled with vessels made of clay and copper. In this chamber a woman works. She is not human, or not entirely. She is something else, taller, longer-lived, possessing knowledge accumulated over spans of time that would seem immortal from a human perspective. She is mixing substances, testing combinations, recording results, and on a stone slab in front of her, 14 forms are taking shape. This is what the tablets describe, and whether you read it as literal genetic engineering or as mythological metaphor for the mystery of human consciousness emerging from the animal kingdom, the result is the same. Humans appear, suddenly, with capabilities that earlier hominids lacked, with language complex enough to encode abstract thought, with brains wired for mathematics, music, storytelling, and the construction of meaning. And in the oldest testimony we have, the testimony pressed into clay by people who claimed to remember, the explanation is not that we evolved. It is that we were made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and who left specific instructions for what to do with us after they were gone. In 1912, a team of scholars working at the University of Chicago completed a project that had taken nearly 2 decades, a comprehensive cuneiform dictionary. The dictionary cataloged every known Sumerian and Akkadian word found across thousands of tablets, providing translations, etymologies, and contextual usage examples. It was, and remains, one of the foundational reference works for anyone attempting to read ancient Mesopotamian texts. On page 347 of the Sumerian section, there is an entry for a term that appears in over 2,000 tablets, spanning nearly 2,500 years of continuous use: Anunnaki. The entry breaks down the etymology. An means heaven or sky. Unna is a verb meaning to descend or to come down. Ki means earth or ground. Together, those who from heaven to earth came. Not metaphorically. The grammatical structure in Sumerian is unambiguous. This is a past tense descriptor, not a title. It describes an action that was completed. They came down, from sky to earth. The dictionary notes that Anunnaki is always used in plural form. It is never singular. You never encounter an Anunnaki in the way you might encounter a god or a king. The term refers to a group, a category, a collective. And across those 2,000 tablets, the Anunnaki are mentioned with a consistency that is unusual for mythological figures. They have names, specific names that appear again and again across different cities, different time periods, different genres of text. Anu, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority. Enlil, called the Lord of the Command, the administrator of Earth operations. Enki, the scientist and engineer, the one who solved problems through knowledge. Ninhursag, the geneticist, the mother of humanity. Ninurta, the warrior. Utu, called Shamash in later Babylonian, associated with the sun and justice. Inanna, later called Ishtar, goddess of love and war. These are not vague archetypal deities representing abstract concepts. They are individuals with distinct roles, personalities, family relationships, and bureaucratic functions. The tablets describe their conflicts with each other, disputes over authority, love triangles, property disagreements, political maneuvering. Enki and Enlil, for instance, are half-brothers who disagree on almost every major decision. Inanna is described as ambitious and frequently overstepping her authority. Ninurta is a soldier who clashes with his father Enlil over military strategy. This is not how mythology usually works. In Greek mythology, Zeus and Poseidon and Hades are brothers who divided the world between them, but their stories are allegorical, their behaviors symbolic. They do not have work schedules. They do not file reports. They do not argue about resource allocation. The Anunnaki do. There are administrative tablets from the city of Lagash, dated to around 2400 BCE. that record rations distributed to workers digging canals. At the top of the ration list, in a separate category, are rations allocated to the Anunnaki overseeing the project. The quantities are specified. The duration of their supervision is noted. This is not theology. This is payroll. Other tablets describe the hierarchy in detail. At the top is Anu, who remains in heaven. The texts are consistent on this point. Anu does not come to earth. He rules from elsewhere, and his commands are transmitted down through subordinates. Below Anu is Enlil, who is physically present on Earth and serves as the operational commander. Below Enlil are approximately 50 senior Anunnaki who hold specific portfolios: agriculture, mining, construction, water management. And below them are 300 beings called the Igigi, the laborers who eventually revolted and triggered the creation of humanity. This is not a pantheon. This is an organizational chart, and the tablets describe the Anunnaki with physical consistency that spans centuries. They are tall, taller than humans, though the exact measurements vary depending on the text. They are long-lived. The king list records Anunnaki kings ruling for thousands of years before the flood, and while these numbers are clearly exaggerated or calculated using a different time scale, the consistency of the claim is notable. They are described as possessing technology. The tablets use words like brilliance, radiance, and splendor to describe objects the Anunnaki carry or wear, objects that emit light without fire. In one text, the goddess Inanna is described as wearing a garment that makes her radiant like the sun. In another, Enlil possesses a weapon that emits a beam that cannot be resisted. In a third, Enki travels in a boat that moves without oars and against the current. These descriptions have been interpreted as poetic exaggeration, gods shining with divine glory, wielding supernatural power. But the language used is not poetic. It is technical. The texts describe these objects functioning, being activated, being repaired. The mainstream explanation for the Anunnaki, then and now, is that they represent a pantheon of Mesopotamian gods invented to explain natural phenomena and legitimize political power. The sun, the storm, the flooding of rivers, the fertility of soil, these were forces ancient people could not understand, so they personified them as divine beings. Kings claimed descent from these gods to justify their authority. Temples were built to appease them. Myths were told to encode moral lessons and cultural values. This explanation works for most ancient religions, but it struggles with the Anunnaki for several reasons. First, the Anunnaki are not associated primarily with natural forces. Anu is the sky, yes, but his role in the tablets is administrative, not meteorological. Enlil is called Lord of the Storm, but his actual function is governance, decision-making, enforcing rules. Enki is associated with fresh water, but the tablets describe him building irrigation systems, teaching humans agriculture, solving technical problems. These are not nature gods, they are managers. Second, the Anunnaki are described doing things that gods in other mythologies do not do. They mine, they build, they argue about labor disputes, they get drunk and make mistakes, they grow tired. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the goddess Ishtar, Inanna, propositioning Gilgamesh, being rejected, and then throwing a tantrum so severe she releases the bull of heaven to destroy his city, an act for which she is later reprimanded by the Council of Gods for wasting resources. This is not divine majesty. This is a person with power acting impulsively and facing consequences. Third, and most troubling for the mythological interpretation, the Anunnaki are described as having come from somewhere. Not metaphorically descended from the primordial chaos or born from the void, but literally traveled from another location to Earth. And the tablets are specific about where they came from. They came from Nibiru. In the Berlin Museum, in a gallery containing thousands of cylinder seals from ancient Mesopotamia, there is a small stone cylinder catalogued as VA243. It is Akkadian, dated to approximately 2500 BCE, though the imagery it depicts is older, copied from Sumerian sources. The seal is unremarkable in size, about 3 centimeters tall, the kind of object you could hold easily in one hand. It was used, like all cylinder seals, to mark documents and containers, rolled across wet clay to leave an impression that served as signature and verification. The image carved into VA243 shows a seated figure receiving a supplicant. This is standard iconography, a person of authority granting an audience. But in the upper left corner of the seal, there is something that is not standard at all. It shows a star, and around that star, arranged in orbit, are 11 smaller circles. Our solar system, as confirmed by telescopes and space probes, contains the Sun and 8 planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, plus smaller bodies, asteroids, dwarf planets, moons. The ancients, using only their naked eyes, could see 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. These 5, plus the sun and moon, gave them 7 celestial bodies, which is why the number 7 became sacred across so many cultures. 7 days in a week, 7 classical planets, 7 heavens. But the seal shows 11 bodies orbiting a central star. If you count the sun as the central body, that means the seal depicts a solar system with 11 planets. The mainstream interpretation is immediate. This is not a solar system. It is an artistic representation of stars in general. The ancient Mesopotamians were skilled astronomers who catalogued stars and constellations. The seal is simply showing a star surrounded by other stars, stylized as circles for simplicity. But there are problems with this interpretation. First, other cylinder seals that depict stars show them as points, not circles. When Sumerian and Akkadian artisans wanted to indicate stars in the night sky, they used starburst patterns, radiating lines suggesting points of light. Circles were used to depict planets, celestial bodies that moved against the fixed background of stars. The distinction was deliberate and consistent. Second, the 11 circles on VA243 are not uniform in size. They vary, some larger, some smaller, and this variation corresponds roughly to the relative sizes of planets in our solar system, if viewed from an external perspective. The central star is largest. The bodies closest to it are small. Further out, the bodies increase in size, then decrease again at the outer edge. Third, and most specifically, the arrangement of the 11 bodies matches descriptions found in a Babylonian creation text called the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish was discovered in 1849 by British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard during excavations at Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital in what is now northern Iraq. He found it in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal, a 7th century BCE a Syrian king who had ordered scribes to collect and copy texts from across Mesopotamia. The library contained thousands of tablets, many of them copies of much older Sumerian and Babylonian works. The Enuma Elish consists of 7 tablets that describe the formation of the world. But unlike most creation myths, which frame creation as an act of divine will or cosmic birth, the Enuma Elish reads like an astronomical mechanics report. It describes a time when the solar system was still forming. It names the bodies that existed: Apsu, the sun; Mumu, Mercury; Lahamu, Venus; Lahmu, Mars; Kishar, Saturn; Anshar, Jupiter, and several others whose names correspond to outer bodies. And then it introduces Tiamat, a large planetary body located between Mars and Jupiter. The text describes a collision. A new planet called Nibiru enters the solar system on a long elliptical orbit. During one of its passes through the inner solar system, Nibiru collides with Tiamat. The impact is catastrophic. Tiamat is split in 2. One half is shattered into fragments that become the asteroid belt. The other half, along with Tiamat's largest moon, is knocked into a new orbit closer to the sun. This becomes Earth. The Enuma Elish describes Earth not as created from nothing, but as a remnant of a destroyed planet, relocated by collision into the orbit where we currently reside. In 1970, a planetary scientist named William Hartmann proposed what is now called the giant impact hypothesis. The hypothesis suggests that Earth's moon formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, when a Mars-sized planetary body collided with the early Earth. The impact vaporized part of Earth's surface and ejected massive amounts of debris into orbit, which eventually coalesced to form the moon. This hypothesis explained several anomalies. Why the moon's composition is similar to Earth's mantle. Why the moon has no iron core, despite Earth having a large one. Why the Earth-Moon system has unusual angular momentum. The giant impact hypothesis is now the leading scientific explanation for the moon's formation. It has been refined and confirmed through computer simulations, analysis of lunar rock samples brought back by Apollo missions, and modeling of planetary formation processes. But the Enuma Elish describes this process: planetary collision, fragmentation, orbital relocation, in a text written over 3,000 years ago. The mainstream response is that this is coincidence. Ancient mythmakers sometimes stumbled onto ideas that happened to parallel scientific discoveries. The human imagination is vast. Given enough cultures telling enough stories, some will inevitably echo reality. But the Enuma Elish is not vague. It specifies which bodies existed before the collision, describes the trajectory of the incoming object. Nibiru approaches from the outer solar system on a retrograde orbit, details the mechanics of the impact. Nibiru's satellites, moons, strike Tiamat first, splitting it before the main body delivers the final blow, and explains the aftermath. Half becomes the asteroid belt, half becomes Earth. Nibiru continues on its elliptical orbit. This is not poetic metaphor. This is description. And if the Enuma Elish is describing real astronomical events, then the CLVA 243 is not showing stylized stars. It is showing what the Sumerian astronomers knew: a solar system containing 12 major bodies, 11 planets plus the sun. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How did they know? In 1894, a Belgian astronomer and historian named Franz Kugler published a study of Babylonian astronomical texts. He had spent years translating tablets that recorded observations of celestial events, planetary positions, lunar eclipses, the rising and setting of specific stars. What Kugler found was that the Babylonians possessed knowledge that should have been impossible. They calculated the precession of the equinoxes. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis. Imagine a spinning top as it begins to slow. The axis of spin starts to trace a circle. Earth does the same thing, though on a vastly longer timescale. The axis completes one full wobble every 25,772 years, modern calculation. This wobble causes the position of the stars to shift slowly over time. The North Star, Polaris, will not always be the North Star. In 12,000 years, the North Star will be Vega. The zodiac constellations that mark the spring equinox drift backward through the sky at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. Precession is invisible to a human lifespan. You cannot observe it by watching the sky for a few decades or even a few centuries. To detect precession, you must compare star positions across time spans of at least several hundred years, ideally thousands. And you must understand that the Earth is a sphere, rotating on a tilted axis, orbiting the Sun. Without that framework, the shifting stars make no sense. The Greeks are credited with discovering precession around 150 BCE, when the astronomer Hipparchus noticed discrepancies between ancient star catalogues and his own observations. Hipparchus had access to Babylonian records, and he used them to calculate the precession rate. But the Babylonian records Hipparchus used were copies of Sumerian originals, and the Sumerian Tablets describe a full precessional cycle, 25,920 years. They called it the Great Year. They divided it into 12 ages, each lasting 2,160 years, corresponding to the 12 zodiac constellations. This division is why we speak of the Age of Aquarius, or the Age of Pisces. We inherited the concept from the Sumerians, who somehow knew that the stars shift in a grand cycle lasting nearly 26,000 years. The mainstream explanation is that the Sumerians inherited this knowledge from an unknown predecessor culture, or that they made lucky calculations based on observations passed down over many generations. But there is no predecessor culture. The Sumerians are, archaeologically, the first, and the idea that oral tradition could preserve precise astronomical measurements across the thousands of years required to observe precession strains, credulity. Unless the knowledge was not observed, unless it was given, by someone who had a perspective that made precession obvious, someone viewing Earth from outside, from a vantage point where the axial wobble would be visible over a much shorter time scale, or someone who had been observing Earth for long enough that thousands of years was, to them, a reasonable measurement interval. There is another set of tablets, called the Mul-Apen series, dated to around 1000 BCE, but referencing observations made centuries earlier. The Mul-Apen tablets are star catalogues, lists of constellations, their positions, their rising and setting times throughout the year. What makes these catalogues unsettling is their accuracy. When modern astronomers use software to reconstruct the ancient night sky and compare it to the Mul-Apen descriptions, they find that the tablets are recording star positions as they appeared around 3000 to 2500 BCE, over 1,000 years before the tablets were written. This means the Sumerians were not just recording what they observed. They were preserving knowledge from earlier epochs with precision that suggests systematic institutional observation spanning millennia. Or they were copying from records created by the Anunnaki. The tablets are explicit about this. In multiple texts, the Anunnaki are described as teaching humanity astronomy. Enki is credited with revealing the secrets of heaven and earth. Shamash is called the one who illuminates the heavens. The goddess Nisaba is the scribe of the gods, the keeper of astronomical records. And in one particularly specific text, there is a passage that describes the Anunnaki showing early humans the stations of the sky and explaining the great cycles that govern time. If you were an advanced civilization arriving at a planet, one of the first things you would do is map the sky. You would need navigational reference points. You would need to understand the planet's axial tilt, its orbital period, its precession cycle. And if you were going to establish long-term operations on that planet, mining, construction, genetic experimentation, you would need calendars. You would need to know when seasons change, when floods come, when to plant and harvest. You would create star catalogs, and those catalogs would be accurate, because you would have the tools and knowledge to measure things precisely. And if, before you left, you decided to give that knowledge to the beings you had created, to give them a chance to continue the civilization you started, you would teach them the sky. You would show them the stars. You would explain the cycles. You would tell them, this is how you track time. This is how you navigate. This is how you know when to plant. Remember this. Preserve this. And they did. For 5,000 years, Sumerian scribes copied those star catalogs, generation after generation, preserving knowledge they could not have discovered on their own. Which brings us to the question the tablets cannot stop asking. Why were the Anunnaki here? What were they doing on Earth that required thousands of workers, that triggered a labor revolt, that led to the creation of a replacement workforce? The answer appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the Enuma Elish, and in dozens of administrative and mythological texts spanning centuries. They were mining. Specifically, they were mining gold. In southern Africa, in the regions that are now Swaziland and South Africa, there are mine shafts that date to approximately 100,000 years ago. These are not natural caves. They are deliberately excavated tunnels, dug in patterns consistent with systematic extraction. The shafts target gold-bearing ore deposits. Modern mining companies have found ancient shafts intersecting their own operations, and archaeologists have recovered primitive stone tools from the tunnels, tools used for breaking rock and extracting ore. The conventional explanation is that early humans mined these sites for ochre, a red pigment used in ritual and body decoration. Gold deposits and ochre deposits sometimes occur together, so perhaps ancient miners were after the ochre and inadvertently dug through gold veins. But the Sumerian tablets offer a different explanation. They say the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. The Atrahasis epic explicitly states that the Igigi were assigned to dig the earth and bring forth the metal the gods require. Other texts describe the Anunnaki establishing operations in a region called ABZU, which translates as Deep Earth or Primeval Source. AB.ZU is consistently described as being far from Mesopotamia, across the sea, in a place where the mining work is difficult and the conditions harsh. Several scholars have noted that ABZU's description matches the geography of southern Africa, a distant region rich in mineral resources, accessible by sea via the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean trade routes that Sumerian sailors are known to have used. But the more pressing question is, why gold? Gold is, from a modern industrial perspective, extremely useful. It is chemically inert, meaning it does not corrode or tarnish. It is highly conductive, making it essential for electronics. It is malleable, allowing it to be shaped without breaking. It reflects infrared radiation, which is why gold foil is used in spacecraft to protect against heat. But to a Bronze Age civilization, gold was primarily decorative. Beautiful, yes. Rare, yes. But functionally inferior to copper or bronze for tools and weapons. The Sumerians valued gold, but they used it for jewelry, temple decorations, and royal regalia, not for practical purposes. So why would gods, or beings sufficiently advanced to be perceived as gods, need gold in quantities large enough to justify creating an entire workforce? The Sumerian Tablets provide an answer that sounds absurd until you consider the physics. They say the Anunnaki needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere. Nibiru, according to the Enuma Elish and related texts, is described as having a dimming sky and a weakening firmament. The texts suggest that Nibiru's atmosphere was degrading, becoming less able to retain heat and protect the surface from solar radiation. The solution, according to the tablets, was to disperse fine gold particles in the upper atmosphere. Gold, being reflective and inert, would form a protective layer, a kind of atmospheric shielding. This sounds like science fiction, but it is, in fact, theoretically plausible. In the 1990s, scientists studying ways to combat global warming proposed injecting reflective particles into Earth's stratosphere to reduce solar heating. Gold was considered too expensive, so alternatives like sulfur dioxide and aluminum were suggested. But the principle is sound. Reflective particles suspended in the upper atmosphere can modulate planetary temperature and radiation levels. If Nibiru was a planet on a highly elliptical orbit, spending most of its time in the cold outer reaches of the solar system, and only briefly passing through the inner system, where solar radiation is stronger, then atmospheric degradation would be a chronic problem. Each time the planet swung out into the cold, its atmosphere would thin. Reflective particles would help retain heat during the long journey. And if the Anunnaki needed large quantities of gold for this purpose, Earth would have been an attractive source. Earth is geologically active, with tectonic processes that bring gold from the deep mantle to the surface. Earth's gold is accessible. And Earth, at the time the Anunnaki arrived, had no indigenous species advanced enough to object to the mining, until, that is, the miners revolted. And the solution was to create a species that could mine but could not revolt. Humans. The tablets are disturbingly clear on this point. Humans were created to perform labor the Anunnaki no longer wished to perform. The Atrahasis epic says this explicitly. Let the primitive worker bear the toil of the gods, not let humans worship the gods, not let humans serve the gods in gratitude. Let them bear the toil, the work, the physical labor. We were created as a replacement workforce, and when the work was done, when enough gold had been extracted, the Anunnaki prepared to leave. But they did not leave immediately, and they did not leave us abandoned. The tablets describe a period, lasting centuries, during which the Anunnaki gradually transferred authority to human kings. This is recorded in the king list, where the early dynasties are said to have been directly overseen by Anunnaki administrators, but later dynasties governed by humans alone. The transition is described as intentional, planned, structured, and before they left, the Anunnaki gave gifts, the ME. The ME are described in multiple tablets as physical objects containing knowledge. They are stored in Enki's temple in Eridu. They are guarded. They are powerful. And in one famous myth, the goddess Inanna steals them. The story, recorded in a text called Inanna and the God of Wisdom, describes Inanna traveling to Enki's temple in Eridu. Enki, drinking heavily, becomes drunk. Inanna, seizing the opportunity, asks Enki to give her the ME. Enki, impaired, agrees. He hands them over. Inanna loads the ME onto her boat and flees back to her city of Uruk. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he has done and sends his servants to retrieve the ME. But Inanna escapes. She brings the ME to Uruk, and the text says that from that moment forward, Uruk becomes the center of civilization, the city where arts, crafts, laws, and knowledge flourish. The ME are listed in the text, over 100 of them. They include kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, music, heroism, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, the craft of the metal worker, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, wisdom, fear, terror, strife, peace, weariness, victory, counsel, the troubled heart, judgment, decision. These are not abstract concepts. They are described as things Enki possesses physically and transfers physically. The text uses verbs like gave, took, carried, loaded. The MEs are objects that contain functions, capabilities, knowledge. If you were leaving a planet after thousands of years of presence, and you wanted the species you had created to continue developing, to build on what you had started, what would you leave behind? You would leave instructions, knowledge, technology encoded in a form they could access. You would give them the fundamentals of civilization, governance, law, craftsmanship, agriculture, writing, and you would trust that from there they could continue. The ME are described as exactly this: a legacy, a farewell gift, a way to ensure that humanity, after the Anunnaki's departure, could sustain and advance what had been built. And then, according to the tablets, the Anunnaki left. Not all at once. The texts describe a gradual withdrawal. Some Anunnaki remain on Earth longer, serving as intermediaries, advisors to human kings. But the majority depart. They return to Nibiru, to their long orbit, to whatever awaited them in the cold outer reaches of the solar system, and they leave behind a single promise, recorded in multiple texts, repeated across centuries. They will return.